There's a version of you that nobody can touch. Not the version you perform at work, or the one you become around certain people. Not the edited, managed, carefully curated self you've learned to present to the world. Something deeper than that. And somewhere inside you, you already know it exists. Because there have been moments, brief and quiet ones, where you felt it. A strange steadiness beneath all the noise, a kind of ground. But then life happens and you lose contact with it. Someone criticizes you and you feel yourself collapse inward. Someone withdraws their approval and suddenly you're not sure who you are. Someone pushes against you and you break in the exact place you swore you'd stay whole. And you wonder, why does that keep happening? Why does it feel like your sense of self depends so heavily on what other people think of you? Why does a single comment from the right person in the wrong moment have the power to unravel weeks of internal work? That's not weakness. That's something much more interesting than weakness. That's the architecture of a self that was built for survival, not for strength. Most of us didn't build our identities. We inherited them. We absorbed them from the people who raised us, the environments that shaped us, the messages that repeated until they became indistinguishable from our own voice. You learned very early what kind of person got love, and you became that person. Or you spent your life fighting against it. Either way, someone else was the architect. And a self that was built by someone else to satisfy someone else will always feel fragile when that someone else disappears or turns against you. Because it was never yours to begin with. Carl Rogers called this the condition of worth. The idea that most of us grow up learning that we are acceptable only when we meet certain conditions. When we're successful enough, agreeable enough, attractive enough, productive enough. And here's the thing nobody tells you about that dynamic. It doesn't stay outside you, it moves in. It becomes the voice inside your own head. The inner critic that sounds suspiciously like someone you grew up with. So when someone criticizes you, you don't just hear them. You hear every version of that criticism you've ever internalized. The echo chamber of a lifetime. That's why it hits so hard. That's why people can break you, not because they're powerful, but because they're pressing on wounds you've been carrying for years. If this is landing somewhere in you right now, if something about this is uncomfortably familiar, then you're already doing something important. You're paying attention to the right thing, because awareness is always where this begins, not fixing, not performing strength, not armoring yourself against the world. Awareness. There's a difference between a person who is hard to break because they've built walls, and a person who is hard to break because they're deeply rooted. Walls create the illusion of strength. They keep things out, but they also keep you locked in. A person who lives behind walls isn't strong. They're defended. And defended people are some of the most fragile people alive, because if the wall ever comes down, there's nothing underneath it. Rootedness is different. A rooted person can be pushed, can be challenged, can hear hard things, feel hard things, experience real disappointment, and still not lose contact with themselves. Because their sense of who they are doesn't live in the opinions of others. It lives somewhere older, deeper, and more personal than that. The question is how you get there. And the honest answer is that it's not about becoming someone new. It's about returning to someone you already are. Someone you may have lost contact with, slowly, over years of adapting to survive. Rogers called this the fully functioning person. Someone who is open to experience, not defended against it. Someone who lives in each moment rather than hiding behind a fixed idea of who they should be. Someone who trusts their own inner sense of what's real, rather than outsourcing that judgment to the people around them. And that last part, trusting yourself, is where most people get lost. Because if you grew up in an environment where trusting yourself led to pain, where your instincts were wrong according to someone you needed, where your emotional reality was consistently denied or punished, then you learn to distrust the very thing that was supposed to guide you. Your own inner voice became the enemy. And so now, when someone challenges you, you don't just question their opinion, you question yourself. You wonder if maybe they're right. You replay the conversation 10 times, looking for the evidence that confirms your worst fear, that you're not as okay as you hoped. If you've ever found yourself in a comment section or in a conversation feeling like your whole internal world could be destabilized by one stranger's words, this is why. It's not because you're too sensitive. It's because your foundation was built on sand, on approval, on external validation, on the shifting ground of what other people think. And sand-based foundations can't hold weight. Think about the people in your life who genuinely seem unshakable, not cold, not arrogant, not indifferent to what others think, just steady. You've probably encountered one or two of them at some point. People who can be disagreed with and not crumble. People who can be criticized and respond from a place of curiosity rather than panic. People who seem to carry themselves from the inside out. What is it that they have that you feel like you don't? It's rarely intelligence. It's rarely talent or experience or even confidence in the traditional sense. It's something more fundamental. It's a relationship with themselves that isn't contingent on what the world reflects back. They're not waiting for permission to feel okay about who they are. Most of us are waiting, constantly. We wait for the promotion that will prove we're competent. We wait for the relationship that will prove we're lovable. We wait for the moment when enough people have validated our choices that we can finally feel settled in them. And the waiting never ends, because even when the validation comes, it doesn't fill the hole it was supposed to fill. It can't, because the hole isn't about what other people think. The hole is about whether you trust your own experience. And this is where it gets subtle, because most people who are stuck in this cycle don't know they're in it. They think they lack confidence. They think they need to achieve more, improve more, become more. They're always running towards some future version of themselves that will finally be acceptable. Rogers watched this pattern in people for decades. And what he noticed wasn't that people lacked willpower or discipline. What he noticed was that people were deeply, chronically out of contact with themselves. They had learned to live from the outside in, scanning the environment for cues about what to feel, who to be, whether they were okay. And the irony is that the more you live that way, the less you actually know yourself. Because you're always adjusting, always calibrating, always performing for an invisible audience, even when no one is watching. Especially when no one is watching. There is something quietly devastating about being alone and still not feeling free. About having no external pressure in the room and still feeling the pressure. About sitting with yourself in silence and finding that the silence isn't peaceful. It's loud with judgment. That's the internalized audience. The critic that never clocks out. And here is what most self-improvement conversations miss. You cannot simply think your way out of that. You can't read enough books, watch enough videos, accumulate enough insights and logic your way to a stable self. Because the instability isn't intellectual, it's experiential. It lives in the body, in the nervous system, in the reflexes that form before you had language to describe them. What changes it is something slower and something more intimate. It's repeated contact with your own experience, without immediate judgment. Feeling something and not instantly labeling it as a problem to be solved. Noticing a thought and allowing it to be there without either fusing with it or pushing it away. Returning, again and again, to what is actually happening in you, not what you think should be happening, not what you'd prefer to feel, but what's actually present. That practice, unglamorous and invisible as it is how the foundation shifts. Not all at once, never all at once, but in incremental moments where you catch yourself outsourcing your sense of reality, and you choose, even slightly, even imperfectly, to consult yourself first. If something about this resonates with you, if you recognize the pattern being described here and feel a quiet pull toward this kind of work, you might find that the other videos on this channel speak to something similar. This is a space built around the belief that understanding yourself more deeply is one of the most valuable things a person can do. Not as a project, as a way of living. So if you haven't already, take a look around. There's more here that might reach you. Now, there's something that tends to come up when people start taking their inner life more seriously. A kind of grief that isn't talked about often enough. Because when you start to understand how much of yourself was shaped by conditions you didn't choose, by environments that required you to be a certain way to be safe, there's a temptation to feel angry about it, or sad, or cheated. That's real. That grief is real. But it sits alongside something else, which is this: knowing that is not the same as being trapped by it. Understanding the origin of your patterns doesn't mean you're condemned to them. It means you can see them clearly enough to begin making different choices, not from the old programming, but from something closer to your actual self. This is what Rogers meant when he talked about becoming a person, not performing personhood, not achieving a fixed identity, but moving slowly, continuously, honestly, in the direction of your own genuine experience. Which means sometimes being wrong, sometimes changing your mind, sometimes surprising yourself with what you actually feel when you stop telling yourself what you're supposed to feel. A strong personality isn't a rigid one. That's one of the most misunderstood things about psychological strength. People often imagine it as hardness, as a kind of emotional armor that repels whatever comes at it. But that's not strength. That's calcification. Real strength is flexible. It can absorb impact without shattering. It can be moved without being swept away. It can hold complexity without collapsing into either defensive certainty or total confusion. The person who says, "I hear what you're saying, and I need to sit with that," is stronger than the person who immediately deflects. The person who can feel hurt and still make a considered response is stronger than the person who either numbs the hurt or explodes from it. That quality, the capacity to feel fully and respond thoughtfully, doesn't come from willpower. It comes from a self that is genuinely inhabited. From someone who has done enough internal work that they're not constantly surprised by their own reactions, not constantly hijacked by old fears dressed in new clothes. It comes from someone who knows, at some level, that they will not abandon themselves in this moment, no matter what this moment demands. And that knowing is everything. Because the deepest fear underneath most psychological fragility isn't really about what others think. It's about whether you'll be there for yourself when it matters. Whether you'll collapse under pressure, not just in front of others, but internally. Whether you'll turn on yourself, abandon your own truth, betray what you actually feel in order to survive the moment. Every time you don't do that, every time you stay honest with yourself, even when it costs something, you are making a deposit into something real. Something accumulates. And most people don't notice it accumulating because they're too focused on the moments when they failed, the conversations where they folded, the situations where they said yes when every part of them meant no, the times they walked away from an interaction feeling like a stranger to themselves. But those failures aren't evidence that you're broken. They're evidence that you're still learning the shape of your own ground, still finding the edges of yourself, still discovering where you actually stand, not where you've been told to stand, not where it's comfortable to stand, but where you genuinely are. And there's a particular kind of courage in that process that almost nobody talks about. The courage not to perform being further along than you are. The courage to be in the middle of something without pretending you've already arrived at the other side of it. Because one of the ways people abandon themselves most consistently isn't through obvious self-betrayal. It's through the subtle performance of a healed version of themselves that they haven't actually become yet. Presenting strength they don't feel. Projecting clarity they haven't earned. Speaking with certainty about things that are still genuinely unresolved inside them. That performance has a cost. Every time you perform a version of yourself that isn't true, you create a small distance between you and your actual experience. And small distances, repeated often enough, become vast ones. The alternative, and this is harder than it sounds, is to be where you actually are. To speak from your actual experience. To allow the uncertainty to be visible, at least to yourself. To stop rushing toward the finished version of the story and be willing to sit in the unfinished middle of it. There is a kind of person who has learned to do this. Who has learned to be in process without being in crisis? Who can hold open questions without demanding immediate resolution? Who can live with the discomfort of not yet knowing and trust that the knowing will come, not because they forced it, but because they stayed present long enough for it to emerge? That patience with oneself, that willingness to be in progress, is itself a form of strength, a quiet one, the kind that doesn't announce itself. It shows up not in grand declarations but in small dignities. In the moment you choose not to apologize for taking up space. In the moment you feel the pull to shrink and choose instead to simply stay. In the moment someone's disapproval lands on you and instead of immediately reshaping yourself to remove it, you pause and you let yourself feel it without letting it define you. Those moments are the architecture of an unbreakable self, not spectacular, not visible from the outside, but real in a way that nothing external can replicate or replace. If this video reached something in you, not just intellectually, but somewhere underneath the thinking, I'd love to know what that was. Leave a comment below. Tell me which part of this hit differently. Tell me what you've been carrying that made this feel familiar. This space works best when people actually talk to each other, and your reflection might be exactly what someone else needed to read today. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe and leave a like, not as a favor to the algorithm, but as a signal to yourself that you're choosing to take your inner life seriously, that you're here on purpose. Because the most important relationship you will ever have is the one with yourself, not the curated self, not the performed self, the real one, the one that was always there. That unbreakable quality, it isn't something you build from scratch. It's something you excavate. It's already inside you, buried under years of adaptation, under the weight of conditions you absorb before you were old enough to question them. And the work isn't to force your way to it. The work is to stop covering it up. Stop performing, stop managing. Stop presenting a version of yourself that was designed to make other people comfortable at the cost of making yourself a stranger to your own experience. Because somewhere underneath all of that, quieter than the noise, steadier than the fear, there is a ground. And when you find it, even for a moment, even imperfectly, you'll understand what it means to be someone that life cannot break. Not because you've stopped feeling, but because you've finally come home.